There are mornings in Africa when the air itself feels heavier, as if the continent is holding its breath. That is exactly how November 25th felt in Luanda, Angola. Long before the cameras were turned on, before the speeches were read from polished glass podiums, ordinary people were already lining the streets, taxi drivers slowing down to watch the motorcades, vendors lifting their heads from baskets of fruit, students whispering that something unusual was happening in their city. They were right. Inside the conference hall, African and European leaders gathered for what many assumed would be another scripted diplomatic meeting. More promises, more photo opportunities, more recycled language about cooperation. But this time the atmosphere was different. There was a seriousness, a tension, a quiet sense that the next 30 years were about to be shaped not by speeches, but by strategic decisions made behind closed doors. For the first time in decades, Africa walked into a negotiation with stronger cards than Europe expected. Not because of charity, not because of symbolic solidarity, but because the world itself has changed. A rapidly aging Europe is running out of workers. A booming young African population is reshaping global markets, and the minerals needed for the green economy, lithium, copper, cobalt, are buried deep in African soil, not European. That is why this summit mattered, and that is why we must pay close attention. Because while most headlines will focus on diplomatic smiles and handshakes, the real story is about power leverage and the quiet reshuffling of global influence. 3 decisions were made in Luanda, 3 decisions that could define who controls the green economy, who shapes African security, and who gets to move across borders in the years ahead. So let me ask you, what really happened inside that room? And more importantly, what does it mean for Africa, for Europe, and for the world our grandchildren will inherit? Stay with us. If you value truth over headlines, and if you believe Africa's rise should be understood, not ignored, please consider subscribing and sharing this message. The next chapter begins now. In the hours leading up to the summit in Luanda, Angola, you could feel the continent shifting. The city was unusually quiet at dawn, with fishermen pulling in their nets along the coastline and street vendors tightening the covers of their stalls as if preparing for a storm they could not name. Even the local radio stations, usually filled with music and chatter, carried an unusual tone. Updates, reminders, the sound of a nation bracing for something bigger than a meeting between politicians. By mid-morning, convoys from both the African Union and the European Union were streaming into the city. This was the 7th AU-EU summit, but it did not feel like the 6th or the 5th or any that came before it. Those earlier meetings had a predictable script. Europe arrived with money and conditions. Africa accepted what it could. But on November 25th, the script flipped before the first handshake. To understand why, you have to zoom out far beyond Luanda and look toward the world of 2035, a world already being written today. By 2035, Africa's population will reach 1.8 billion, with a median age of 22. Meanwhile, Europe's median age is drifting above 45, its workforce shrinking faster than policymakers can replace it. A continent with fewer young workers cannot sustain its industries, its healthcare systems, or its innovation cycles. Simply put, Europe is running out of the very resource Africa has in abundance, people, and that's only the beginning. The world is accelerating toward a green transition. Electric vehicles as the new normal, renewable grids powering entire economies, battery storage embedded into nearly everything. But batteries do not come from speeches or treaties. They come from minerals, lithium, copper, manganese, and especially cobalt. And more than 60% of the global reserves of these minerals lie in Africa. The Democratic Republic of Congo alone holds over 70% of the world's cobalt, more than the rest of the planet combined. Europe understands this painfully well. Today, nearly 80% of the world's battery production and most rare earth processing is controlled by China. For Europe, this dependency is not just inconvenient, it is dangerous. A continent that cannot control its energy future cannot control its geopolitical future. That is why European leaders boarded planes for Luanda with urgency, not ceremony. They weren't thinking about 2025 or even 2030. They were thinking about how to stay relevant, how to stay influential in a world where minerals and demographics will decide the winners of the next century. But something even more significant happened. Africa realized its own leverage. African negotiators walked into Luanda with clarity and coordination rarely seen in past decades. They understood that minerals' population growth and the newly competitive global environment gave them bargaining power no longer based on hope, but on mathematics. For the first time, Africa had options, multiple global partners, multiple investment pathways, multiple offers on the table. This is the environment in which the summit began. During the opening sessions, European leaders emphasized cooperation, global stability, and shared futures. It all sounded familiar until African delegates subtly shifted the conversation. Instead of reacting, they initiated. Instead of accepting agendas, they proposed them. The central message was unmistakable. Africa will not repeat the extractive models of the past. If Europe wants minerals, markets labor, or security cooperation, it must respect Africa's terms, not just its needs. And from that moment, the dynamic in the room changed. Three major issues were placed at the heart of the negotiation, each one capable of restructuring African and European futures for the next 30 years. The competition for green economy supply chains. The question of who funds and controls African security. The future of migration, mobility, and the movement of skills. These were not side discussions. They were the spine of the summit, the reason both continents showed up with their most seasoned negotiators. What unfolded in Luanda was not a diplomatic event. It was a recalibration of global power shaped quietly by demographics, minerals, and a continent that finally recognized the value of its position. As the summit moved into its second day, something shifted outside the conference walls. The streets of Luanda grew louder, drivers honking through heavy traffic, small crowds gathering at intersections, young people huddled around phone screens, trying to read updates as they came in. You could sense a rising tension, the kind that appears when everyone knows decisions of historic weight are being made just a few blocks away. Inside the negotiation rooms, the tone changed as well. What had begun as cautious diplomacy quickly escalated into the most decisive and high-stakes dialogue Africa and Europe had shared in decades. The moment of Traore arrived, when Africa placed three non-negotiable issues directly onto the table, each one tied to the continent's long-term sovereignty. The first showdown revolved around the Lobito Corridor, a 1,300-kilometer artery stretching from the port of Lobito in Angola through the mineral belts of the DRC and Zambia. European leaders presented it as a partnership for development, but African negotiators saw it differently. This was the gateway to the world's most valuable minerals of the next century. The tension peaked when the African delegation stated clearly, "We will not build another extraction highway." It was a moment that silenced the room. For decades, raw minerals had left African ports without being processed on the continent, stripping African nations of trillions in added value. But this time, Africa refused to repeat that model. They demanded local processing plants, value addition within African soil, regional jobs tied directly to cobalt and copper refining, integration into the African continental free trade area. This was a direct challenge to Europe's assumption that access to raw materials would continue uncontested. European negotiators had not anticipated such unity or resolve. For the first time, Africa wasn't asking for inclusion in the global supply chain. It was setting the terms of how that supply chain would operate. Observers in the room said the atmosphere was electric. Some delegates leaned forward, others exchanged glances. The balance of power had shifted and everyone felt it. The second point of confrontation came when Europe proposed long-term funding for AU-led peacekeeping missions through the UN backed by Resolution 2719. On paper, it looked like a victory. Predictable funding reduced dependence on ad hoc donor packages. But African negotiators asked the uncomfortable question, if you fund our missions, do you also control our decisions? Silence. This cut straight to the core of the issue. Europe wanted stability in regions that affected migration and resource flows. They wanted peace, but not deployment. Support, but not shared command. African delegates emphasized that any strings attached would simply recreate old patterns of dependency under a new label. If peacekeeping was to be truly African-led, then autonomy in deployment, mandate setting, and decision-making had to be guaranteed. The tension in the room reached a breaking point. European officials knew Africa had alternatives. Gulf nations, China, BRICS partners, all had shown interest in funding African security without heavy political conditions. For Europe, that was a geopolitical alarm bell. The third moment of high drama came when migration was discussed. Europe introduced new frameworks for legal migration pathways, student visas, skill recognition agreements, and labor mobility channels. But alongside these promises were clauses for tighter border controls and accelerated return agreements. Young Africans watching from home immediately understood the contradiction. Delegates from West and North Africa pushed hard. They argued that meaningful mobility required accessibility, not selective entry. If legal pathways were too narrow, Europe would simply be tightening the cage while leaving the door open for a chosen few. This was not a small disagreement. It became one of the sharpest thematic divides of the summit. The most surprising reaction came not from Europe, but from within Africa. Rather than negotiating individually, the AU bloc stayed remarkably united. They referenced China's Belt and Road Gulf investments and BRICS expansion, all subtle reminders that Africa was no longer a passive recipient, but a sought-after partner in a multipolar world. European negotiators, sensing the new dynamics, softened their tone. They expressed willingness to reconsider the implementation mechanisms, especially on supply chain processing and AU security autonomy. Observers later said this was the moment Europe realized the old playbook no longer worked. The climax of Luanda wasn't a dramatic walkout or a shouted argument. It was the quiet, confident, coordinated insistence of African leaders who finally recognized their leverage and used it. In the days following the summit, the dust had barely settled in Luanda when the real consequences began unfolding, felt not by diplomats, but by ordinary people across both continents. On the streets of Kinshasa, young miners discussed rumors of new processing plants that might finally allow them to move beyond dangerous, low-paying extraction work. In Lusaka University, students gathered around cafeteria tables, debating whether Europe would truly open its doors to African graduates. And in Lisbon, retirees watching the evening news wondered whether the aging continent could realistically adapt to the demographic wave heading its way. These reactions were not random. They were tied directly to the three major decisions forged inside those meeting rooms. And they revealed something important. The summit wasn't just about high-level policy. It touched real lives, real fears, and real hopes. For millions of young Africans, the stakes were enormous. The promise of legal migration pathways, study visas, recognition of qualifications, skilled labor entries sounded like a life-changing opportunity. Families across West and Central Africa began calculating what this could mean for their children. A pathway to Europe could mean better education, safer employment, and a chance to build a future free from instability. But alongside excitement came anxiety. Many worried that legal pathways might remain small, symbolic programs available only to top-tier students or narrowly defined skill groups. Others feared that increased border enforcement would make life harder for migrants already living in Europe or those trying to flee conflict zones. This created a deep emotional divide, hope mixed with skepticism. In online forums, African youth expressed a sentiment repeated hundreds of times. If visas become real, this changes everything. But if not, it's just another promise. The summit also shook political dynamics within the African Union. For the first time, the AU had negotiated as a unified bloc, and the success of that strategy emboldened many governments. In nations like Zambia and the DRC, leaders framed the Lobito Corridor commitments as victories for national pride and industrial sovereignty. Politicians pointed to potential job creation, new refineries, and domestic value addition as proof that Africa was no longer content to be a warehouse of raw resources. But unity also created pressure. Countries with governance challenges, corruption, weak oversight, fragile institutions faced immediate scrutiny. Civil society groups began demanding transparency. Where would the new mineral processing funds go? Who would monitor the peacekeeping budget flows? How would migration agreements be implemented on the ground? The message from African citizens was clear. If we now have leverage, we must not waste it. In Brussels, Berlin, Paris, and Rome, the political consequences were equally intense. Europe's domestic debates were already volatile: economic slowdown, rising populism, and disagreements over migration. Now, European leaders had to defend a new type of partnership, one where Africa negotiated with strength, not dependency. Some European politicians saw this as a necessary shift, an overdue recognition of Africa's central role in global supply chains. But others viewed Africa's stronger stance as a threat to European interests, fueling rhetoric about losing influence or conceding too much. The public reaction reflected this divide. While older Europeans appreciated the practical need for African labor and minerals, younger Europeans worried about job competition, rising migration numbers, and geopolitical insecurity. This internal polarization meant one thing: Europe might struggle to fulfill the promises made in Luanda. Ultimately, the summit set off a chain reaction across both continents. African youth began reassessing their future: stay and build, or leave and seek opportunity. African governments felt a new wave of political pressure to use their leverage wisely. European societies confronted the reality that their future prosperity would rely on partnership, not dominance. And civil society groups on both sides began monitoring every early sign of success or failure. The political class spoke in terms of strategy. Ordinary people spoke in terms of survival. And that is why the outcomes of Luanda carry such emotional weight. They are not abstract decisions. They are promises with the power to shape lives. Across the Atlantic, the Luanda summit triggered a quieter but equally significant ripple. In Washington, analysts within the State Department, the Pentagon, and the National Security Council began examining the agreements line by line. They were not just assessing Europe's new commitments, they were measuring what Luanda meant for America's long-term strategic interests. For years, U.S. policymakers have watched Africa become the center of global competition. China built roads, dams, and digital infrastructure. Gulf nations invested heavily in ports and agribusiness. Russia offered security partnerships and political backing. And now Europe, pushed by its own demographic crisis and energy insecurity, had been forced to renegotiate its approach. To American observers, the message was unmistakable. Africa was no longer a secondary theater, it was becoming one of the decisive arenas of the 21st century. From the U.S. perspective, the most pressing issue was not migration or peacekeeping, it was minerals. The United States has its own green energy ambitions, from expanding EV production to securing battery supply chains. And American officials have long known the numbers. 60% of critical minerals essential for clean energy manufacturing are found in Africa. 70% of the world's cobalt lies in the DRC. Battery-grade processing remains overwhelmingly dominated by China. When reports from Luanda confirmed that Europe had agreed to support local processing within Africa, some American policymakers quietly worried, because an Africa that processes its own minerals not only keeps more value, it also gains more bargaining power over the U.S. and global markets. In several Washington think tanks, the reaction was consistent. If Europe is accelerating its African partnerships, the U.S. cannot afford to fall behind. There was also attention on Europe's new migration framework. The United States faces its own demographic concerns: an aging population, labor shortages in healthcare and technology, and the growing need for skilled foreign workers. African professionals, particularly in tech, medicine, and engineering, have increasingly seen the U.S. as a destination. Now, with Europe offering expanded pathways, Washington recognized a potential shift in talent flows. American policymakers understood the stakes. If Europe opens doors more effectively, the U.S. might lose out on African talent that has historically supported American innovation and healthcare sectors. This was not a minor concern. It directly touched the heart of U.S. domestic economic competitiveness. Outside the West, the rest of the world was watching Luanda with a very different emotion: curiosity mixed with recognition. China, the most significant external actor in Africa, viewed the summit through a long-term lens. They were confident in their entrenched position: roads, ports, digital systems, manufacturing plants. But they also recognized that EU-funded corridors like Lobito could over time diversify African options. That meant Beijing would need to offer even better terms if it wished to maintain influence. Russia, facing Western sanctions and seeking geopolitical openings, watched the security component closely. AU-led peacekeeping backed by UN financing could reduce Africa's reliance on private military contractors or Russian advisory missions. Moscow understood that if Africa found new funding sources, their informal influence could narrow. The Gulf states, especially the UAE and Saudi Arabia, saw opportunity. Diversified partnerships would increase competition, creating openings for Gulf-led megaprojects in logistics, agriculture, renewable energy, and ports. In short, Luanda signaled something every global actor recognized: Africa is entering a phase where it chooses its partners, not the other way around. Ultimately, U.S. officials did not view Luanda as a threat, but as a reminder. A reminder that Africa's rise is accelerating. A reminder that cooperation must be built on respect, not paternalism. And a reminder that the future of global power runs through new corridors, some of them made of asphalt and steel, some of them made of ideas and demographics. For Washington, the lesson was clear. If the United States wants to remain relevant, it must engage Africa as a strategic equal, not an afterthought. When the summit in Luanda finally ended and the delegates boarded their flights home, the city returned to its ordinary rhythm, vendors reopening their stalls, fishermen hauling boats back to shore, school children weaving through traffic on their way home. But beneath that familiar rhythm was a quiet truth. Nothing about the relationship between Africa and the world would ever be the same again. The decisions made in those 2 days were not just policy adjustments. They were signposts pointing toward a future where minerals, demographics, and mobility will shape global power far more than speeches or diplomatic ceremonies. And whether these commitments become real change or fade into forgotten promises depends entirely on what happens next. This is where the warning comes in. History teaches us that declarations are easy, implementation is hard. In the coming 12 to 24 months, 3 pressure points will reveal the truth. Will the Lobito Corridor actually evolve into a value-added supply chain with minerals processed on African soil rather than shipped out raw? Will UN-backed peacekeeping funds arrive predictably, allowing African-led missions to operate with autonomy rather than dependency? Will visa pathways open at scale, giving millions of young Africans real opportunities? Or will those doors quietly narrow as border controls tighten? If these commitments stall, Luanda becomes just another summit, another chapter in the long book of unmet promises. But if they move forward even imperfectly, then Africa steps into a new era of leveraged confidence and global repositioning. This is why your awareness matters. This is why your attention matters. Global shifts don't happen with fireworks. They happen through quiet signals, contracts being signed, corridors being built, policies being implemented, opportunities expanding or collapsing in silence. And the more we watch, the harder it becomes for leaders on either side to retreat into old patterns. For Africans in the diaspora, for Americans watching from across the ocean, and for elders who have witnessed decades of geopolitical cycles, this moment deserves reflection. Africa is negotiating its future in ways that were unimaginable a generation ago. Leaders like those in the Sahel Alliance, including voices such as President Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso, are shaping continental debates about sovereignty, minerals, agriculture, and the meaning of independence in the 21st century. These discussions are not separate from Luanda, they are part of the same story. And so I leave you with a question. If you were advising African leaders today, with all the leverage granted by minerals, demographics, and global competition, what would you demand in exchange for access technology, transfer debt relief, mobility rights, or something deeper? Your perspective matters because public awareness has the power to shape policy far beyond what most people imagine. If this analysis gave you clarity, please share it, especially with someone who believes Africa is still a passive actor in world affairs. And if you believe that truth matters more than headlines, more than political spin, more than diplomatic theater, then subscribe and stay with us. The next chapter is unfolding right now, and together we can follow it not as spectators, but as a community that understands how power works in a changing world.